He saw the clothesline before he saw the smoke. He had stopped his horse on the ridge above the valley, the same ridge he had stopped on 7 years ago, the morning he rode away, to look at the ranch one final time before going down to close it up and sell it and be done. The valley was the same. The cabin was the same. And there, strung between the old cedar and the fence post exactly where it had always been strung, something moved in the April wind. A woman's dark skirt, a white apron, 2 smaller pieces of cloth, like handkerchiefs, fluttering at the end. His wife had been dead for 7 years. He sat on the ridge for a long time. Then he rode down. Before this story goes any further, if you have ever gone back to a place you were sure you were done with and found it had moved on without you, subscribe to this channel and stay with me through every word. Drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels tonight, because the man riding down from that ridge came to close a chapter he has been avoiding for 7 years. And what is waiting for him at the bottom of that hill is going to show him for the first time why he never quite managed to do it. His name was Grant Lorne, and he had not intended to come back. He had left the Pale Ridge Ranch in the 2nd week of April, 1877, exactly 7 years before, to the season, the week after he buried his wife Merritt under the cottonwood by the east fence. She had been sick since January, the fever working through the territory that winter, and he had nursed her for 11 weeks and lost her on a Thursday morning when the snow was still gray on the ground. He had packed 1 bag and told himself he was going for a season. A season became a year. A year, in the way of things left unreversed, became 7. He had worked cattle drives and railroad camps and a long stretch as a wilderness guide in Wyoming, moving from one piece of work to the next, with the methodical persistence of a man who could not afford to stop and ask himself what he was doing. He had been trying to outrun something that moved at exactly his pace. The county assessor had tracked him to Wyoming with a letter. 3 years of delinquent taxes on the Pale Ridge property, 60 days to pay, or it would go to auction. He had wired the money, nearly everything he had, and eventually his lawyer in Pale Ridge had written to say that absentee ownership of a working ranch with no one working it was not a sustainable arrangement. Grant should either return or sell. He had chosen to return in order to sell. Her name was Della Voss, and she had moved into the empty ranch the previous August. Her husband had been a homesteader whose claim was rejected after 3 years of work because the original survey was wrong and the ground was already taken. The claim loss broke Claude in ways that 4 winters of hard labor had not, and he died of a riding accident the following spring. Della had stayed in the territory because she was someone who lived in Montana now and did not know how to be otherwise. She was 34 years old, and large in the way of women who had done heavy work from girlhood. Not apologetically large. Not large as though it required explanation. Simply large, the way mountains were large, as a fact of the physical world. She had been working as a cook at a roadside inn until the owner sold it to someone who brought his own cook. She had packed what she owned and ridden out of Pale Ridge with no particular destination. The Lorne Ranch had been empty when she arrived. The door was unlocked. She had gone in to sleep one night and had stayed 8 months. She had not been idle. She had kept the stove working through a hard winter. She had repaired the east fence post that had gone down in November and would have let the cattle through if there had been cattle. She had tended the kitchen garden that Marit Lorne had planted from seed packets still in the barn. She had worked from the notes Marit had kept in the back pages of her almanac, and the garden had come through in better shape than the previous 2 years, which was a fact Grant would discover and not know how to account for. She had fed the old gray cat who lived under the porch, and who, at 9 years old, had apparently decided she had no intention of dying until someone noticed her again. In Pale Ridge, when Della made her monthly trip for supplies, the town had its particular way of taking note of a large woman from the empty Lorne ranch. The measuring look, the pause in conversation, the slow arithmetic of it. She had learned to walk through these looks the way she walked through cold weather, directly, without adjusting her pace, getting to where she was going and coming home. She had been doing it her whole life. She knew the way through. She had done the laundry that morning. The window was open. She did not hear the horse on the ridge. He tied his horse at the post and stood for a moment looking at the cabin. The window had curtains he didn't recognize. The porch step, the one that had been giving since the spring of 1876, appeared to have been repaired. The kitchen garden showed green at the margins, though it was barely April. He knocked. She opened the door and they looked at each other. She was large, nearly his height, and she looked at him with the expression of a person who had known this day was coming and had decided to meet it directly. "You'll be Grant Lorne," she said. "That's right, Della Voss." She stepped back from the door. "You'd better come in." Inside, it was his house. The table, the chairs, the cast-iron stove, the shelf with his books still standing where he'd left them. Marette's almanac on the shelf, worn soft at the spine, and alongside all of that, woven into the spaces his absence had left, her life. Her preserves on the shelf, her sewing by the window, a pot of rosemary on the sill. The kitchen garden visible through the glass, the one Marette had put in 3 seasons running. He saw the cat. She was in the chair by the stove, the gray one, older than he would have thought possible. Marette had found her as a half-grown stray in the autumn of 1875. When Grant left, he had not thought about what would happen to her. He had assumed, over 7 years, that she would simply be gone. He stood looking at the cat for a moment. Then he sat down in the other chair, the one that had been his, and the cat regarded him for 3 seconds before standing, crossing the space between them and settling in his lap as though 7 years were a detail that didn't much concern her. He sat very still. "She was under the porch when I arrived," Della said. "Half-starved." "What do you call her?" he asked. "She's never told me," she said. Something shifted in his face that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. He looked at the almanac on the shelf. "The garden records," he said, "in the back pages." "That's where I worked from," she said. He nodded. He looked at the window, at the garden, at the cat, who had closed her eyes in his lap with the certainty of an animal who had always intended to be there. "I came to sell the place," he said. "I know," she said. Word of it had reached Pale Ridge in February, carried by the particular speed at which land news traveled in small valleys. "I expect you'll need the cabin cleared," he said. "I expect you'll want time to look at things first," she said. He considered this. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight." "South wall," she said. "Second board from the end. There's a draft where the wind gets in." He looked at her. "I haven't gotten to that one yet," she said. He picked up his bag. He went to the barn. He fixed the board before he rolled out his bedding, because once he knew about it, he could not unknow about it, and some things simply needed doing. He told himself he was staying to assess the property before selling it. This was partly true. 220 acres required looking before it could be fairly valued, and he walked it over the first several days. The south pasture, the creek that ran off the north ridge, the east fence line that someone had restrung the bottom quarter of within the past several months. He found the evidence of her work at every turn. She had done things quietly and without remark, the way she seemed to do most things, and the property was better for all of them. He did not tell her this. He noted it and kept walking. On the 5th day she cooked from the almanac, not the garden records in the back pages, the margin notes in the front, where Moret had written recipes in the small spaces around the printed text. Cornbread with dried sage and rendered fat, a thing Moret had made every winter morning for the 6 years they were married, and which Grant had not tasted since she died. The smell of it came through the barn wall before the bread was out of the pan, warm and specific and particular to this kitchen, in a way that made him set down the harness he was mending and stand still for a moment. He came inside and sat at the table. She set the pan between them. He looked at it. He picked up the bread and ate without speaking, which was not unusual. He rarely spoke when he was thinking, but this was a different kind of silence. The silence of a man who was hearing something through the walls of 7 years that he had not been prepared to hear. He ate most of what was in the pan. Then he got up and went outside and stood at the east fence for a while with both hands on the top rail. Through the kitchen window, Della watched him. She did not go out. She covered the rest of the bread and put it on the shelf. She had worked out by the 3rd day that he was a man who communicated through what he did, rather than what he said, and she had adjusted accordingly. They moved through the ranch in a rhythm that was not comfortable yet, but was becoming functional. He took the heavy work. She kept the house and the garden. They ate their meals without much conversation, and without any awkwardness that either of them chose to name. The cat preferred his lap, but she slept at the foot of Della's bed, which Della understood to be the cat's own accounting of where things stood. On the 9th evening, Grant was in the barn late with a piece of tack that needed attention, and the window was open to the April air, and he heard Della's voice through the gap in the south wall that he had failed to fully close. She was talking to the cat. He walked the whole east fence today, she said, all of it, top to bottom. A pause. He fixed the gate latch. He didn't say anything about it. Another pause. I think he's trying to figure out if he can leave again. The cat said nothing. Della said, I know something about that. Going away from a place you should have stayed in. Her voice was quiet and without self-pity, the way she said most things. He loved her very much. You can tell by what he won't look at. Grant sat in the barn with the tack in his hands and did not move. On the 11th day he picked up the almanac. He had been avoiding it. He had looked at the shelf every morning since he arrived, and looked at the almanac's spine, and looked away, because Moret's handwriting was on every page of it, and he was not ready for her handwriting. But on the 11th day he was alone in the cabin. Della was in the garden, and he picked it up and opened it to the front pages, where Moret had written in the margins around the printed calendar. He had not expected what he found there. Not the recipes, not the garden notes. In the last pages of the front matter, in Moret's small and careful hand, she had written something that was not a recipe and not a record. It was addressed to no one and to him at once, the way a person wrote when they knew they might not be there to say it directly. She had been sick for a month when she wrote it. She had known, before he had let himself know. He read it slowly. He read it twice. Then he set the almanac on the table and went to the barn and stayed there until after dark. When he came back, there was a plate of food on the porch step and a lamp beside it, still lit. Della had gone to bed. He sat on the step and ate in the dark, with the Pale Ridge Valley spread below him, and the creek audible in the quiet, and the mountains gone to black outline against the sky. He sat there for a long time. Trask arrived from Billings on a Thursday in the 2nd week, having ridden 40 miles to finalize what Grant's lawyer had described as a straightforward transaction. He was a land speculator, well-dressed, efficient, practiced at making the acquisition of other people's land feel like a favor to them. He walked the property with Grant and made encouraging sounds about the improved condition of things, and at no point during this walk did he look at Della except to establish, with a brief downward assessment, that she was a squatter whose removal would be handled through standard channels after closing. In the kitchen that afternoon, Trask spread his papers on the table and talked about timelines. He mentioned, almost as a clarification of terms, that his buyer, a developer from Helena, was particularly interested in the water rights to the creek that ran off the North Ridge. Once acquired, those rights would be redirected for a new venture upstream. The details were not Trask's concern. He was the middleman. Della, from her place by the stove, said quietly, "The families downstream water their cattle on that creek. 3 farms. The Pratt family has been there 15 years. Trask looked at Grant in the way of a man who found bystander opinions a mild inconvenience. That would be a matter between the buyer and the downstream users, he said, not something that affects the sale. Grant looked at Della, then at the almanac on the shelf where he had put it back after the barn, then at Trask. "Give me until morning," he said. Trask pushed. He had ridden 40 miles. He had a buyer standing by. "Morning," Grant said. Trask went to the Pale Ridge Hotel. That evening, Grant and Della sat at the table after supper. "You've met the Pratts," he said. 8 months of being their neighbor," she said. "I know their names. I know which of their children is sick every winter." He looked at the almanac. "Merritt wrote about the valley in the front pages," he said. "Not just the garden, the creek, the families. The way things depended on each other. She paid attention to all of it." "I know," Della said. "I read the front pages too." He looked at her. "I left those pages alone," she said. "They weren't garden records." He nodded slowly. "She knew this valley the way you knew your homestead," he said. "Like it was a responsibility." "Yes," Della said. "That's the word." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not selling to Trask," he said. She looked at him without surprise. He understood, from this, that she had not been sure, but had been hoping. "The creek alone would undo what took 2 decades to build in this valley," he said. "And the rest of it," he stopped. "Merritt would have had something to say about it. I already know what it would be." Della folded her hands on the table. She said nothing. "I don't know yet what I'm going to do instead," he said. "You don't have to know tonight," she said. The Pale Ridge General Store was not large, but it held 11 people on a Friday morning when Grant arrived to tell Trask his decision, and by the time the conversation reached its height there were 14, because news traveled through small towns the way water traveled through good soil. Quickly and without effort. Trask presented the contract. He spoke about what had been agreed, about the timeline, about the legal weight of a signed offer, and what it meant to withdraw one. He spoke for several minutes with increasing force and decreasing composure. Grant let him finish. Then he said, quietly enough that the room had to go quiet to hear it, "I've been gone from Pale Ridge for 7 years. I came back to sell a place I couldn't stay in, and I found it better than I left it, because a woman I'd never met had kept my wife's garden alive and read my wife's notes and made herself useful to something she had no obligation to and no claim on." He paused. "Trask wants the creek. The Pratt family has watered cattle on that creek since before my wife died. I'm not selling the creek." He looked at Trask. "The offer had a contingency clause for my lawyer's review. It has not passed that review. I'm withdrawing it." Trask said several more things. Among them was a comment about the large woman from the Lorne Ranch and what a man's judgment could be inferred from the company he kept on a remote property. Grant waited for him to finish. "You can speak to my lawyer about the contingency clause," he said. "I'm going home." Outside, Della was on the bench by the hitching post, where she had waited rather than go inside, because she had learned to wait in the way of a person who had done a great deal of it and knew the difference between waiting that was useful and waiting that was not. He came out and stood beside her. "Well," she said. "I'm not selling," he said. She looked at the mountains for a long time, and the way she looked at things she was deciding how to feel about. "You didn't have to do that on my account," she said. "I didn't do it on your account," he said. "I did it because it was right, and because Moret would have told me to." He stopped. "And because I've been gone 7 years, and I find I'm not ready to be gone anymore." She was quiet. "Why did you stay?" he said. 8 months in a house that wasn't yours, that you had no claim to." She thought about it in the way she thought about most things, completely and without rushing. "Because it was a good house," she said, "in a good valley, and something in it was worth maintaining whether anyone was watching or not." She looked at the creek where it bent through the south pasture, catching the light. "And because I recognize a place that's waiting for someone to come home to it." He looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything else about it, standing outside the Pale Ridge General Store in the April morning. Some things were complete without being spoken, which both of them had lived long enough to know. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, with the valley going gold around them and the creek audible before it was visible. When they came over the last rise, the cabin was below them, the clothesline empty now, her washing long since brought in, and the kitchen garden showed its first green of the season where Merritt's seeds had been planted in Merritt's rows by a different pair of hands. The cat was on the porch step. She watched them arrive and went inside. Della put the kettle on. Grant sat at the table. He took the almanac from the shelf and opened it to the front pages. He turned to the last thing Merritt had written, which he had read 11 times in the barn and could not stop reading, and he slid it across the table to Della. She read it. She read it slowly, the way she read most things, completely without skipping. Then she closed the almanac and put her hands flat on the cover. "She knew you'd come back," Della said. "She did," he said. "She didn't know about me." "No," he said. "But she wrote that whoever was in this house after her should be made welcome." He looked at the table. She was particular about hospitality. Della looked at the almanac, then at the window, then at the table, where Grant had laid out 2 cups and 2 plates at some point in the previous minutes. She had not seen him do it, only noticed it now. She had been eating standing at the counter for 8 months. She sat down. Outside, the Pale Ridge Valley was doing what it did in April, running full with snowmelt, the creek loud in the evening, the mountains still white at the crown. The kitchen garden held its first week of grain. The cat settled on Moret's chair with the authority of an animal who had outlasted everyone's expectations and intended to continue. Della Voss had moved into a stranger's house in August because she had nowhere to go, and she had kept it the way she kept everything, fully, without reservation, with the attention of someone who did not know how to do things halfway. She had tended the garden and fed the cat and read the almanac and had not once treated any of it as temporary, because she was the kind of woman who understood that something worth doing was worth doing as though it mattered, whether anyone was watching or not. She had not known, keeping it, that she was the kind of person a place waited for.